Alrighty, so for each of the questions, we're basically going to categorize what type of question they are before we actually do them. So let's begin then with number 12. So number 12, I can see that we're basically creating a list here. It says new theories, new practices, and technologies. So it's basically a list question. And if we can also see when we look at the answer choices, I see that there's 2 in choice A, also in B, and then in addition in choice C. So it's technically a list / a repetition question, and we'll see why in just one second. So when you create a list, you have to put an end before the last term. So we can see that there's an end right over here. So when you already say new theories, practices, and technologies, it's completely unnecessary to say to, also, or in addition, because those words mean the same thing as the word and does. So the only choice that's avoiding repetition and is also preserving the correct structure of the list is going to be option D. Alrighty, looking at number 13, this is looking at the choices. I can see the punctuation is the thing that's changing here. So this is going to be then a punctuation question. So let's talk about what the different pieces of punctuation do. So what we can do with a dash, so a dash right here in choice A, a single dash, so a single dash has 2 main functions. So the first of which is specification, and the second of which is emphasis. Looking at choice D, that has a semicolon in it. A semicolon is an opportunity. Let's write this down here. We'll erase all this after, of course. A semicolon is an opportunity to separate 2 full sentences. So separates 2 full sentences. And commas in choice C, we can see here, the reason why I'm writing commas and not comma is because there are actually 2 in the sentence if we pick choice C. You want to notice that there's already a comma after manufacturing, so picking choice C would put another comma before the word from right here, so that would make what we call double commas. So commas, double commas, the purpose of them is to surround extra information. So basically, if you can read around the information that's inside of the double commas, then that means that you should in fact put double commas because the information inside of it would be considered extra. So let's try crossing that out and reading around it. Workers in many fields must continually acquire relevant knowledge and update key skills. So that makes perfect grammatical sense without the information inside. So I want to go ahead and put the double commas, which makes choice C the correct answer. Alrighty, so now let's erase all of this stuff that we had written before so we can make some room then for number 14. So number 14, all of these words here, accordingly, nevertheless, regardless, and similarly, these are all what we call transition words. So transition words are basically an opportunity to segue between one idea and the next. You could either be adding information, doing a logical cause and effect, contrasting what you had just said, and so on. So let's talk about what each of these words mean and what they're used for. So nevertheless and regardless, these are both in the contrast category when we're basically going against what we just said or saying this is besides the point, something along those lines. Similarly, we use for a comparison when we're pointing out some common feature in 2 situations, and accordingly is used for cause and effect. It's basically a fancy way of saying the word therefore. So if you want to spice up your next essay, stick in accordingly instead of therefore. So what we want to do for transition word questions is read the sentence before the transition word and then read the one after. And then we're going to see how the 2 will relate to each other and figure out which word best does the job. This practice of continued education, aka professional development, benefits not only employees, but also their employers. So we know employees and employers will both benefit from having the employees get an education. So then when we look at the next part down here, it says blank. We don't want to read the word because we don't know if that's right. Blank, meaningful professional development is a shared responsibility, the responsibility of employers and also the responsibility of employees. So we're saying that it benefits both parties. And then here we're saying that it's a shared responsibility. So these two sentences definitely go together. So I don't want to pick B or C because those are used for contrast. We're not comparing the fact that the benefits apply to both of them to the fact that it's a shared responsibility. We're not comparing. We're more so saying because it's going to benefit both parties, it's a shared responsibility. So we want a cause and effect word, which then gives us choice A. All right, number 15 is like a main argument type of question. So this question, when you're actually doing the SAT, you want to come back to something like this because we have not read the full passage. So I don't know what this passage is honestly about at this point. It seems like it's about employees getting more educated and how that would benefit the company overall. But we don't have enough information to genuinely answer this. So we're going to come back to this guy at the end. All right, let's look at number 16. So in number 16, I want to talk a little bit more about a period and a semicolon. So on the SAT, a period and a semicolon do exactly the same thing. The purpose of both of them is to separate two full sentences. So because we can see the choices A and B have punctuation that's identical, period and semicolon, and the wording is also the same, we're going to knock those both out because these are both exactly the same answer choice. So looking now at number 16, this again is definitely a punctuation question. So I first want to talk about choices A and B. So a period and a semicolon on the SAT are identical answer choices. They do exactly the same thing. Their purpose is to separate two full sentences. So because choices A and B have exactly the same punctuation, a period and a semicolon, and the same wording, contend and then, we can knock out both of those choices because we know that these are exactly the same answer choice. So then we're between C and D. And I noticed that choice D has a comma, and there's already another comma in the sentence between workplace and these. So as we talked about before, if I can surround this whole part here with double commas, it means that I can successfully read around that information and the sentence will still make sense. So let's give that a shot. If employees find themselves falling behind in the workplace, then it is the duty of those employees to identify and even pay for appropriate resources. Makes complete sense, so we want to go ahead and pick the choice that creates double commas. So that's going to be choice D. Alrighty, number 17, we can see that these choices are all kind of saying the same thing, but with different words, like address their deficiencies, deal with their flaws and shortcomings. They're all aimed at saying the same type of thing, but there are variable lanes. So this type of question is what I call a Sas question. Sas stands for short and sweet. So when we look at the choices, there's no need to say deal with their flaws and shortcomings. That's repetitive. Allow them to meet their employer's needs in terms of the knowledge they are supposed to have. It's just so long and clunky. We don't want to pick that. Same thing goes with A. Show them how and why they are falling behind and what to do about it. With that, obviously, that's the whole point of getting more of an education. So we're going to then go with choice B here, the shortest and the sweetest. Number 18 is a formality question. So on the SAT, we want to think of formality on a spectrum. So you're going to have choices that are informal, basically things that you would be saying in conversation with a friend. And then you're going to have choices at the same time that are too formal. Basically, if it sounds like something William Shakespeare would say, that is probably not going to be the right answer. So you want to pick, as the person taking the SAT, what I like to call the middle ground answer. Basically, the answer that is sufficiently formal, but it's not too over the top. It doesn't sound like you were looking through a thesaurus trying to hit a word count or anything like that. So let's then check out the choices. So choice A, get old and worn out, is informal, so that's not gonna work. Are no good anymore? Definitely not, that's very informal. Choice C, become obsolete, that sounds reasonable, I'll squiggle that. Have lost their charm. Charm is an informal way of characterizing it. So we have to then pick choice C. That's the only one that's sufficiently formal. It's not informal, and at the same time, it's not over the top. They didn't give us for this question anything that's over the top, but sometimes, they like to sound like William Shakespeare, and that would also be inappropriate for a question of this type. All right, number 19 is what we call a subject-verb agreement question. So subject-verb agreement is basically the idea that the subject and the verb have to align in terms of the quantity. So for example, Jackie, I am a singular person. You would say Jackie is cool. So is also a singular verb. You would not say Jackie are cool because are is a plural verb. So you can't pair that with Jackie, singular subject. However, if you said the bottles were useful, we pair were with the bottles because bottles and were are both plural. So bottles is a plural subject, were is a plural verb. So subject-verb agreement is all about keeping the subject and the verb consistent in the quantity that they refer to. So the SAT, they really like to complicate subject-verb agreement questions by making the subject particularly challenging to identify in the sentence. So a lot of people assume, don't write this down or screenshot this is wrong, that the subject is usually the thing that comes right before the verb, like here, employees. But actually, the subject is usually the thing that comes first in the sentence. So here it says the most common forms. So that's going to function here as our subject. And as we know, forms, that refers to more than one, so that is a plural subject. So when we say the forms includes, no, includes is a singular verb. The forms include, that would make sense because include is a plural verb. The forms including, well, including is an unconjugated verb, so that can't work. And has included, you cannot say the forms has included, so that's also singular, so that's got to go. So we have to then pick choice B. Question number 20 is just like, which one was it? Question number 14, it is a transition word question, but this one's actually easier than the last one. So this is a transition word question. So here's a really great tip. If you see that 3 of the choices, A, B, and C, all have transition words and choice D does not have a transition word, pick choice D because that's a sign you don't actually need the transition word. And transition words are always optional in a sentence. They just add a little extra spice if you want to think of it like that. So if they give us a choice to delete, let's delete. Okay, 21. This is, of course, going to be like a graph or a figure type of question. So which choice makes the writer's description of the figure most accurate? So let's start with choice A. Receiving coaching and consultation is the overarching framework. Well, that's not true. It's not the biggest circle here, so that's false. B, participation in foundation and skill building workshops is the overarching framework. Again, that's just simply not true because that's not the biggest circle. C, membership in a professional network is the overarching framework. That's true. D, receiving coaching and consultation is the overarching framework. Nope, that's not the biggest circle, so it's got to be choice C then. Number 22. So this is also a punctuation question. All right, so we've already talked about what the single dash does previously. Let's now talk about what a single comma does. We've only been talking about double commas, and also let's talk about a colon. So a single comma is an opportunity to separate one non-sentence. If you know any grammar, you might have heard of this referred to as a dependent clause from one full sentence. So a full sentence, you might have heard of that referred to as an independent clause. So a comma is an opportunity to separate a non-sentence from a full sentence, if you aren't familiar with the terminology. So let's see what we end up having here. Employers can also identify is not a sentence. Identify what? Like it's an incomplete thing. So that's not a sentence. Which employees have successfully completed modules? Well, we can't start a sentence with the word which, so this is also not a sentence. So we can't use a comma because that separates a non-sentence and a sentence, and both of them are not sentences. So choice A is out. Choice B is a colon, which is actually really similar to the single dash. A colon and a single dash, both are kind of like an opportunity to elaborate a little more, provide some follow-up information. And before we're allowed to ever use a colon or a single dash, we always need to have a full sentence, and then we're allowed to use a colon, or then we're allowed to use a single dash. But as we just said, employers can also identify is not a sentence, so we can't pick either B or D, so we're left then with choice C. So we don't put any punctuation when they are both not sentences, because the idea is that they have to stay together to make one big coherent sentence, which they do. If we read this all as one term, it would say employers can also identify which employees have successfully completed instructional modules and which need to be offered additional training. All right, so we might have thought we were done, but remember we skipped number 15, which was the overarching theme of the passage. So we can see that this is all talking about the shared responsibility that the employers and the employees have, and that employees need to continue getting an education to stay updated in their field. So we can see that in this paragraph, it says critics of employer-provided professional development. So these are people who are critical of the fact that employers have an obligation or a need to give their employees continued education. So let's see what they might have to say. They're saying that if employees find themselves falling behind, then it is the employee's duty to figure out what's wrong and to get their own education amped up. So let's start with A. Never talks about a popular career path, so that's not going to work. They should lean heavily on their employers. Well, people who criticize that would say the opposite. So choice C is actually the opposite, that they must be in charge of their own career, so that sounds good. D, will be ready for changes in the job market. The critics aren't even talking about changes or adaptability in the job market, so it has to be choice C. Somebody who criticizes the employers basically giving their employees an education would say, actually the employees should be in charge of that themselves.